Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe my channel. Enjoy the listening. Galactic aliens fed an 8-year-old human girl to their Albino Deadliest dragon, not knowing she was dead. The Garrock High Tribunal met in the Tower of Silence, where mercy had long ago been written out of law. Above them, spun the cold stars of the KES belt, a dead quadrant of space dotted with derelict moons and exile colonies. The tribunal's chamber pulsed with humming energy as 13 warlords deliberated over the fate of a single fragile creature, a child. The human girl, 8 years old, stood barefoot on the obsidian platform in the center of the room, her tiny figure dwarfed by the immense arcs of light above her. A force field kept her contained, though the guards had long since stopped underestimating her. Her hands were bound not because she had weapons, but because they feared what might happen if she wasn't restrained. Her name was Arya Kale, and she was a problem. She had arrived in Garrock custody by accident, intercepted aboard a smuggler ship fleeing human-controlled space. The crew had scattered, but Arya remained, wandering through the warship corridors as if they were playgrounds. Within days, the ship's navigational AI was corrupted, their reactor codes rewritten, and their armory somehow emptied of everything but foam darts. The crew begged for her removal, so they brought her here. On her first night in containment, Arya had managed to hotwire her energy cell with nothing but a stolen spoon and a handful of stray wire. When the lights went out in the detention ring, they found her sitting on top of the warden's desk, sipping something from his favorite mug, humming softly to herself. The Garrock called her a pest, a parasite, a nuisance. But today they would make her an offering. High Lord Scarth, the tribunal's oldest member, leaned forward on his throne, his mandibles clicked in distaste. The child is not fit for imprisonment. She confounds our systems, disrupts our order. She will be executed. No, not executed, hissed Warlord TRX, whose brother's cruiser had been hacked mid-flight by Arya with nothing but a console T-pad and stubborn defiance. Let her be fed to the Pale One. That name stole the breath from the room. Drex, the albino dragon buried deep beneath the citadel, chained in a cavern laced with plasma-bound steel, had, in centuries of failure, slept the most feared creature ever captured by the Garrock, pure white from claw to fang, eyes burning with silver fire. It had torn through empires before it was brought down in orbit over the Los Prime. No weapon could control it, no voice could command it except hunger. The tribunal agreed with grim silence, no debate, no objections. A child wouldn't last 2 seconds. They called the guards, and Arya was taken below. The elevator descended for what felt like an eternity, no windows, no light save for the red glow of the security panel above the doors. Arya stood still between 2 armed guards, neither daring to look at her. The silence between them was not out of respect, it was fear. She was humming, just barely beneath her breath, the same lullaby she sang the night she dismantled the engines of the cruiser Black Fawn while its crew slept. That time she had been angry, this time she was cheerful. She had heard them say the name Dreeks, and something in her chest stirred at the sound of it, not dread, not defiance, something else. The doors hissed open into a corridor thick with vapor and humming with the pulse of containment fields. The walls were scorched and clawed in deep grooves, a memorial to everything that had tried and failed to kill what lived below. At the end of the corridor, a gate stood sealed with 6 interlocking rings of plasma. The guards input the sequence with trembling fingers, their weapons raised though they both knew they wouldn't matter. The gate parted. Beyond it was blackness so complete it swallowed the light, but Arya stepped forward without hesitation. The cavern's heart was vast, cathedral-like in scale, its floor covered in fractured stone and bones too large to belong to any single species. At the center of the cavern lay the dragon, Dreeks. It was still, almost carved from ice, massive wings curled inward like a cocoon, horns spiraling backward from its skull, claws like shattered moons. Its body rose and fell with slow, measured breaths. Arya stopped only a few feet away. Behind her, the guards withdrew. The gate closed with a final clang, and the red lights dimmed. She was alone, but she didn't feel alone. She stepped closer, tilting her head as she examined the great beast's snout, where a ring of plasma metal had once been locked. Its eyes remained closed, its breath fogging the ground. "You're not sleeping," she said softly. The dragon's eyes opened, 2 slits of molten silver locked on the girl. Arya did not flinch. "You're just pretending." The dragon's chest rumbled, a low, thunderous growl that made the rock beneath her feet tremble. She didn't move, didn't blink. Then she smiled, crooked and full of trouble. "Want to play?" Drex did not answer with words, it never had. No voice, no telepathic whisper, no mind-link interface like the Council's tamed war beasts. Its voice was a thundering storm of silence and fire, it had no interest in conversation. But when Arya smiled and asked to play, something moved in the dragon, a ripple across ancient bones. The albino monster shifted, its wings slowly unfurled with a rasp like metal dragged across stone. Its long body stretched out, claws slicing grooves into the earth, tails swaying behind with a heavy rhythm that spoke of balance and barely restrained fury. The dragon stood taller than the cavern's central pillar, its head descended slowly, brought level with the human child who stared back at it as if she were watching a candle flicker in the wind. Arya's curls hung around her dirt-smudged cheeks, her bright blue eyes fixed on the creature. The child made no move to run, she was breathing quickly now, not in panic but in the kind of wild exhilaration only humans were foolish enough to feel when standing on the edge of annihilation. The dragon opened its maw, heat poured forth, the bones scattered on the cavern floor, and the air rattled. It shimmered as though bent through a furnace, a flicker of fire danced in the back of its throat, a white flame, deathless and pure, and still. Arya did not move, she stared into the inferno of Drix's mouth, as if daring it to try her. And something strange happened, the flame receded, the dragon's breath slowed, and for the first time in centuries, its terrible, blinding eyes narrowed, not in hunger but in thought. Arya stepped closer. She was barely up to the height of its kneecap, a smear of flesh and bone standing before an ancient engine of destruction. She raised a hand, neither shaking nor hesitant, and reached out. Her fingers brushed the cold, smooth plate of scale just under its jaw. It felt like marble kissed by frost. "You're cold," she said. The dragon blinked once, a slow, deliberate movement. "You're not really angry, are you?" she whispered. "They think you are, they think you're just teeth and hate, but you're not." There was a pause, then Drix exhaled long and slow and lowered its head, not in submission but in inquiry. Arya grinned and sat down cross-legged in the dust and bone beside the beast's curled claw. "I'm Arya. They told me you'd eat me, that you wouldn't care, but you looked lonely to me, and I think maybe we're a little alike." The dragon turned its head to watch her and listened. Above the lair, the tribunal was still in session, but its order had fractured. It began with silence, then came the alarms. The guards who had escorted the child into the pit had not returned, the surveillance feeds, patched in to entertain and satisfy the council's bloodlust, had gone dark minutes after Arya entered the chamber. No screams, no flame, just static and then silence. The councillors assumed the girl had been vaporized instantly or crushed, but now unease crept in. Scarth paced near the edge of the viewing deck, his mandibles twitching in rhythm. Treek snarled and demanded, "Reinforcements, be sent 12 elite units, fully armed, dispatched to finish what the dragon had kindled." No one wanted to admit aloud what they were thinking, that the girl might still be alive, that Drix might have hesitated. They pulled a backup feed from a lower angle. The grainy footage flickered and fuzzed, but one image froze them all, Arya sitting calmly with her back against the beast's claw legs, swinging as she spoke animatedly to the great dragon who watched her like a scholar studying a text. It made no sense, no logic, no science, no weapon could tame Drix. The chamber erupted into chaos. What is she doing? She's manipulating it. No human child has that kind of cognitive control, she must be an agent, bioengineered. But X, the tribunal's youngest member, stood slowly and said, what none of you dared, she's not manipulating it, she's making it see her. Scarth snarled and slammed a claw into the platform. She's turning it against us. X shook his head. No, she's turning it with her. They argued for hours, but the moment had already happened, a shift, a crack in the foundation of fear the council had built for generations. If the dragon was no longer theirs to unleash, no longer an executioner of their will, it meant something far worse. They had lost control, and someone else, something small, someone ate, had taken it without ever raising her voice. They authorized the breach, 3 elite units, full assault, direct entry to the dragon's chamber. Jean didn't stop them, he didn't try. He simply watched the door close behind them and whispered under his breath, "You're going to wish she'd eaten you down in the dark." Arya looked up at the dragon with a curious smile. "You felt that, huh, Dreeks?" Its ears twitched, its tail thumped against the stone. Arya stood and dusted off her knees. "They're coming, the metal boys, probably with more of those tick-tick guns. You're not going to eat them, are you?" Dreeks leaned closer. Arya tilted her head. "No, I didn't think so." She grinned, a spark in her eyes that had lit up control rooms and broken reactors. She looked at the dragon, then at the approaching tremors of footsteps in the tunnel. "Well then," she said, hopping onto Dreeks' foreleg like it was a playground swing, "I guess we'll just have to scare them." The dragon's lips curled and, for the first time in years, it smiled. The soldiers came like a hammer, their boots echoed through the narrow caverns, pulse rifles humming, faces masked in chrome and fear. 3 squads of the Garrix Elite Reaper Corps, clad in shock armor that bristled with suppressor fields and micro-targeting drones, descended into the dragon's chamber with one objective: neutralize the anomaly, whether it was the beast or the child or both. It didn't matter. They expected a battlefield, they expected carnage. They did not expect silence. The moment they breached the outer threshold, the heat sensors began to misfire. The air, once thick with sulfur and the stink of scorched bones, had shifted, it was colder now. The lights dimmed, not from power fluctuations, but because something in the atmosphere drew the brightness inward, feeding on it like breath. The squad leader, a grizzled veteran named Corvex, gave the signal to hold formation behind the mirrored plate of his helmet. His pupils dilated despite the infrared, his HUD was warping, data stuttered, and the sound of static crept in from all channels, not loud, but insistent. "Maintain order." Corvex barked. "Target is the child, second target is the beast. Do not engage unless necessary." But the moment he said it, the stone beneath them pulsed. It was subtle, barely more than a tremor, but the kind that wasn't tectonic, it was personal. It came with a sound low and distant, like something vast stirring from a dream it never wanted to wake from. One of the soldiers at the flank staggered back. "Something's watching." They turned the corner and saw her. Arya stood alone in the center of the cavern, her back to them, her silhouette lit faintly by the shimmer of molten veins that ran through the ceiling far above. She was small, impossibly small, against the backdrop of cracked bones and ruined armor. Her hands were at her sides, her hair was tangled, glowing faintly from bioluminescent pollen that clung to her. Behind her, the shadows bent. Corvex signaled a silent approach. The Reapers fanned out, rifles raised, motion trigger safeties disengaged, but not one of them took a step closer because something was wrong with the silence. It wasn't empty, it was watching them back. "Arya, don't move. Do you really want to do this?" Corvex hesitated. "You are not authorized to. Lie down, hands behind your head, no." Behind her, 2 glowing slits opened in the dark. Corvex saw them, but by then it was too late. Dreeks unfolded from the black, a phantom pulled from the mouth of myth. His scales gleamed like frozen milk, matte and beautiful, his body coiled with ancient restraint. He didn't roar, he didn't charge. He moved forward like a whisper given form. The soldiers froze, their targeting systems failed, every HUD went dark, the smart rifles bristled with unreadable data, sensors looped and glitched. Some fell to their knees, not from pain, but from feeling an emotion that slammed into them like a forgotten childhood memory of standing in the dark and realizing something was in the room with them. Korvax struggled to breathe. It's in our minds. Arya finally turned. Her eyes glowed faintly with the same eerie white as the dragon behind her. You shouldn't have come. One of the soldiers broke, he screamed, dropped his rifle, and ran back the way they'd come. No one stopped him. The others couldn't move, their muscles rebelled against their weapons, their hearts pounded so loudly they couldn't hear each other. The breathing fear wasn't being inflicted, it was being mirrored. Then Dreeks moved. He stepped around Arya, placing his bulk protectively between her and the soldiers, wings folding close but ready, his claws dug into the stone and carved messages into it without speaking a word. Korvax fell to one knee. What is she? Arya's expression softened. I'm just a girl, she said, but he listened to me. Maybe because I didn't scream, maybe because I didn't beg, or maybe because I said, hello, instead of, kill. Drex, rumbled the dragon low and pleased. Arya walked forward, past the dragon and the stunned soldiers. She stopped beside Korvax and tilted her head. You look tired. Korvax stared at her, vision swimming. You were sent to kill something that didn't need killing. That's what you do, right? Clean up messes, pretend the council's mistakes, or someone else's fault. Don't speak of the council, I'll speak of whatever I want. She snapped, they dropped me here like trash. You're just here to sweep it up, but I'm not trash. I'm fire in the wrong hands. She turned and walked back to Dreeks, climbing up his leg with the ease of a child climbing a tree. She settled between his shoulders, and the dragon lowered himself, wings spreading, body poised. Korvax didn't raise his weapon, no one did. And Dreeks took to the air, not with violence but with purpose. The cavern cracked open above them, stone peeled like paper under the heat of his breath. Arya rose through the dust and ash, her silhouette framed by firelight, and the reapers watched, broken and awed, as the child they came to eliminate rose like a goddess born from the ruin of everything they thought they controlled. By the time Arya tore through the crust of Garrick's moon and rose into the ink of space, the stars were already watching. News traveled fast in the galaxy's underbelly, faster than sanctioned reports, faster than encrypted council broadcasts. Something had happened on Garrock, something impossible. An 8-year-old human girl had walked into the lair of the deadliest creature the galaxy had ever feared, and the dragon had chosen her. From the cockpit of a rusted cargo hauler, a former warlord named Tyan watched the first grainy footage and rubbed the edge of a cracked tooth. I saw that thing eat a city once, he muttered. She didn't even flinch. In the farthest quadrant of the remnant belt, a network of rogue AIs paused their endless war games to analyze the psychic distortion signatures pouring from Garrick's surface. The readings were laced with strange echoes, half-dreams encoded in the data, not power, not corruption, but sympathy. Arya and Dreeks soared through the void, silent and unchallenged. The girl sat at the back of his neck, arms stretched wide to feel the windless wind of stars brushing past them. She wasn't laughing, she wasn't speaking, she was listening. Dreeks listened too. They passed the rim of the starless system and turned toward the reach, where abandoned colonies drifted like forgotten thoughts, where broken habitats waited for power, where forgotten ships floated, their crews lost to time and bureaucracy. Arya looked down upon these places and felt a tug she didn't understand, not yet. These weren't places to burn, they were places to heal, and maybe, just maybe, she could help. Dreeks circled a derelict station once held by slavers. His breath melted the chain still clinging to its docking claws. Arya slipped inside and found survivors, children like her, alone and forgotten. She didn't ask questions, she simply opened the hatch, reached out her hand, and said, "Come on, I've got room." They came one by one. She wasn't just the girl who survived the dragon anymore, she was the girl who freed it, and now the girl who came back for everyone else. Back on Garrock, the council held its emergency vote. Half demanded her eradication, the other half begged for her protection. But no one knew where she was anymore, only that the stars had begun to whisper her name, Arya, the girl who walked with the pale flame, the girl who didn't fear the end because she was it. Deep in the void between systems, where signal beacons sputtered out like dying fireflies and the Council's laws frayed into myths, a shadow passed over the drifting wreckage of a 1,000-year-old battle, not a fleet, not a warbird, but a single creature, ivory white and silent, gliding on wings that shimmered with residual starlight. Upon its back sat a child. Arya's eyes scanned the expanse below her, legs dangling over Drixa's shoulder. She had been quiet for hours, and Drix, attuned now to her rhythm, did not disturb her thoughts. It was a silence that knew the weight of too many questions. Beneath them drifted the wreck of the Worm Hound, a battle cruiser that once enslaved half the Carry Moons, now reduced to twisted metal and frozen corpses. Garrock had found children there, survivors in the lowest decks clutching each other for warmth, orphans of a war they never started. She brought them aboard the dragon, fed them what she could, and promised them they would not be left behind again. Now they huddled in the makeshift hold of a repurposed freighter she had quietly repaired in orbit, connected by cables and welded plating to Drixa's armored spine like a traveling caravan in space. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. She had no army, no banner, but every day more signals reached her distress beacons, silent pings from systems long forgotten, pockets of life still breathing under the weight of extinction. She answered the ones she could. Words spread faster than she did. On Rialta Prime, traders whispered of the white flame that melted the gates of a labor prison and left behind a trail of empty chains. On New Sidra, a mining baron found his private army reduced to tears when a girl walked into the refueling chamber and asked the question they'd buried for decades, "Why are you still obeying monsters?" On the broken moon of Zealer 3, where a rogue biotank had terrorized local settlements, Drax simply roared, once, and the creature curled up like a pup at Arya's feet. She didn't give orders, she didn't shout, she simply stood where others ran, and Drake stood behind her. The Council's surveillance grew desperate. Their agent intercepted transmission after transmission, always too late. The girl left no trace, only stories, survivors, and fear in the hearts of those who once ruled without question. Back on the Citadel, in a room darker than space itself, Zorthvel, supreme overseer of the Garrock Tribunal, stared at a single still-frame image projected on his war table, Arya standing beside Drix, with her hand on his muzzle, a halo of fire and dust surrounding them like a crown. She is not just a child, he growled to the silent chamber, she is an idea, and ideas are harder to kill than dragons. The broadcast came without warning. Every public relay on Garrock, from the high towers of the tribunal to the rusted info panels in the sewage sectors, flickered with the same image, Arya sitting cross-legged on a ship hull, one knee up, arms resting lazily on it, looking at the camera as if she were talking to a friend. "Hi," she said, voice calm and clear. "I figured it's time we talk. No security override, no encryption signature, just my voice echoing through the infrastructure of a planet that once sentenced me to death. You threw me to a dragon," she continued, brushing a curl from her cheek, "you wanted me to die, and maybe you thought you were done with me, but he didn't eat me, he listened." Drixa's shape rose behind her, a blur of ivory scale and burning light. The image shimmered as his breath fogged the feed with pale mist. "And now I'm listening to others, a lot of others, forgotten ones, abandoned ones, people like me, people you'd rather not think about." Zorro fell, storming into the council hall mid-broadcast, his cloak flaring like shadow. "Cut the feed," he shouted, but no one moved. Arya's voice continued, not loud but unstoppable, "I'm not here to start a war. I'm here because you already lost it, you just don't know it yet." She leaned forward, face filling the screen. "There's no throne that can stand if the people underneath it stand up." And then she smiled, not cruelly, but with the gentle, terrifying confidence of someone who had faced the worst they had to offer and come out with a dragon at her side. The screen cut to black. On Garrock, riots broke out in the lower sectors, not violent, not chaotic, but deliberate. Coordinated doors opened, prisons unlocked, power grids rerouted to the poor districts. Somewhere, someone whispered, "Arya walks with us." On stations orbiting council worlds, citizens began demanding answers. Why was she condemned? Why was she hunted? And why was it that when she returned, all she did was rescue people? The council scrambled, orders were drafted, bounties posted, but it was too late. The idea had already spread. In the silent, cold of space, Arya sat once more beside her dragon, watching the systems light up with unrest and hope. She looked over at Dreeks, who blinked slowly, content. "I think we just started something," she chuckled softly. The dragon tilted his head, exhaled a stream of ghostly flame that scattered across the stars like falling embers, and, for the first time, the stars above Elant 5 burned violet that night, not because of solar flares or system anomalies, but because Dreeks passed through them and, in his wake, came a shimmer that turned dark matter to flame. The last bastion of Garrock control on the frontier, the Citadel of Thorns, rose from the planet's crust like a rusted spear. Its towers bristled with rail cannons, its hangars swarmed with gunships, its perimeter was ringed with plasma mines set to detonate on proximity. It had never been breached, it had never even been challenged until today. Above, the storm-churned sky. Arya stood on the prow of a commandeered courier frigate, boots planted firmly, arms crossed, a half-smile on her face as she looked down on the fortress below. Dreeks coiled around the ship like a white ghost, his body a living shield around them. Other vessels, freighters, junk ships, smuggler crates now refitted with salvage weapons and emergency thrusters, drifted. None bore flags, none were part of any alliance, but all had arrived because Arya had whispered simply and clearly, "They've had enough." She didn't call it a revolution, she didn't have to. The Garrock defenders opened fire first, they always did, protocol over logic. Hundreds of plasma rounds screamed into the sky, illuminating the clouds and bright arcs of death. Drones swarmed upward like hornets, and the air began to crackle with high-altitude dogfights. But then came the roar. Dreeks descended, wings wide, a spear of living light. He didn't burn everything, he didn't have to. One roar, one pulse of sound and flame shattered the minefield, sent the lower watchtowers crumbling, and silenced the planetary defense grid. The dragon's breath swept like a wind of ice fire, not to destroy, but to clear the path. Arya dropped from the ship with nothing but a gravity cuff and a makeshift glider cobbled from old scavenger tech. She landed softly amidst the smoldering courtyard of the Citadel, her boots crunching over cracked stone. Garrock soldiers surrounded her, weapons raised, unsure whether to fire. She stood alone, no armor, no shield, just an 8-year-old girl in a weather-worn jacket with a dragon watching from above. She raised her voice, not a shout, but a truth louder than any command, "You don't have to follow them anymore." The soldiers hesitated, not because of her words, but because in that moment every sensor on their HUDs flickered, every targeting system refused to lock, and every internal system registered the same message, "You are seen." Some dropped their rifles, some turned and walked away, a few knelt. She moved through them like a gust, calm and certain. In the heart of the Citadel, the tribunal lords waited behind reinforced glass and plasma barriers. They had never known fear, but today they felt it, not from fire, but from understanding. The girl they had thrown away had returned, not to kill them, but to show them what they had already lost. Inside the throne chamber, Zorth Vel stood tall, still clinging to the illusion of control. "You can't rule them," he hissed. "You're just a child." Arya stepped forward. "I don't need to rule anyone," she said. "That's what you never understood." Zorth sneered. "Then what are you?" She looked at him, threw him a smile, and said, "I'm the one who didn't die," and that was enough. The chamber fell silent. The lords didn't argue, they didn't resist, they just stood, stripped of the power they had forgotten to fear, hope. Not in speeches, not in armies, but in a girl who had once been thrown to a monster and came back with its heart. It didn't end with a coronation, there was no throne, no palace, no anthem. Arya didn't stay after the fall of the citadel. She vanished once more into the stars, not to hide, but to listen, to seek the cracks in the galaxy where power still crushed the voiceless. She and Dreeks became something more than legend, more than rebellion, they became a promise. On the mining colony of Roxton 4, she arrived quietly when a labor riot turned bloody. The corporate guards lowered their weapons the moment they saw her silhouette emerge through the fog. Dreeks glowed behind her like a living constellation on the moonless world of KTH. She stood between two warring clans and simply said, "Enough." And it was in the far rim sector that children spoke of her like a bedtime tale. "Be kind," they'd whisper, "or Arya will come with her dragon, not to scare you, but to ask why you forgot how to care." She didn't take credit, she didn't take power, she took responsibility. Everywhere she went, systems shifted, the old gears of control groaned and cracked, and in their place something new took root, not perfect, not pure, but possible. In time, she became harder to find. Some said she returned to Earth, to the forgotten fields where flowers still bloomed under an unbroken sky. Others claimed she lived in the stars themselves, riding the edge of nebulae with Dreeks watching over the places where the light hadn't reached yet. But the truth, Arya was never meant to be found. She was meant to remind us that no one is too small to make monsters listen, that fire, when given a voice, doesn't have to destroy, it can warm the world. And the girl they fed to the dragon, she taught it how to love.